If Russia goes further with this invasion, we stand prepared to go further as with sanctions.
Sanctions are steps that governments take to interrupt the trade, the technology flows of other countries when they're trying to impose some principles or when there's been some form of wrongdoing. They can establish norms of international behavior, can seek to register opposition to acts of aggression or of nuclear proliferation or support for terrorism and the like. And they also become a vehicle that can sometimes spark a negotiation process. For the United States to impose sanctions on another country requires a pretty elaborate political process. There is authority on the statute books that grants the president emergency authority to impose sanctions. So to use the current example of Russia, all sanctions now involve the targeting of specific entities or individuals. So in this case, there's been the targeting of principal Russian banks, then the various subsidiaries of their major financial institutions, and many of the leading political and economic figures. And we've also established secondary measures where these sanctions that we impose have global application, so that if a state or a company wants to do business in the United States, they'll be prohibited from doing so if they trade with a sanctioned entity. We're basically using the power of the dollar and of the American economy as a leverage to encourage other states to join us in imposing these measures of economic sanctions. If we think that sanctions by themselves will be sufficient to coerce a major power to change its behavior, that rarely happens. On the other hand, sanctions certainly signal international disapproval of particular actions. They help to uphold a norm, a principle of international law. So under international law, it's a violation of law. It's a crime against the peace to invade another country. They can sometimes also cut off the supply of weapons and materials that are used for military action and for repression. This is a frequent pattern you see in sanctions where there'll be an arms embargo, so they'll cut off the supply of weapons, and that'll affect also technologies or materials that could be used for weapons of mass destruction. There used to be the idea that you could just sort of put trade sanctions on a country and they would force their political leaders to make a change. But politics doesn't work that way, especially in authoritarian dictatorial regimes like Russia or Iran or North Korea. The leaders don't care pretty much what the people experience, sadly. So it's necessary then to target the top level institutions in the society, and especially to try to target the military capacity of those regimes for two purposes. One is just to limit the damage that they can cause, but also to really get at the core underpinning of their power in their societies, which is often their military power. And this points to another factor about sanctions. They're more likely to be effective when they're multilateral. If the U.S., even as powerful as we are, if we just put sanctions on a country, they can always find someone else they can trade with and get what they need. But if they're multilateral through the UN, in cooperation with the European states and with our allies in Asia, as these sanctions are on Russia, then the prospects of success are much higher because they don't have anywhere else to go. Yes, Russia can get microchips from China, but it can't get high-end microchips that are necessary to run their missile systems and their accurate weapons programs. They may be able to run their washing machines or their consumer electronics, but they're not going to enable the state to operate its sophisticated military equipment. Sanctions are always going to have a humanitarian impact, a broader social impact. As in the current case with Russia, if you block all of their major banks, you block their access to their strategic reserve funds, that's going to affect the entire economy. And you can begin to see already in Russia, banks are seeing a run on their currencies. The ruble has dropped to record lows. Interest rates have already jumped to 10%. So that's going to affect the average person. And that's one of the big challenges. How can you impose measures that put pressure on the leadership without harming the average citizen? Those who impose the sanctions, in this case, like the US, but especially the European states, you have to be willing to pay a price yourself because you're losing trade. And with the case of Russia, it's a pretty lucrative trade. Can you really cut off the finance of the super wealthy and high-tech sectors and the military sectors and allow for some basic trade to continue? That's the intention. And we'll see in the coming weeks how that works out.